be back in Boise. We're delighted tonight to welcome Maggie Haberman to Boise. After a long day of flying. I think you must have woke up about 2 in the morning, Boise time. In a world of point-to-point connections, Boise still doesn't have a direct flight to New York. I'm not saying it's intentional, but you never know. Prior to joining the New York Times in 2015, Maggie covered City Hall for the New York Daily News, the 2008 U.S. presidential campaign for the New York Post, and wrote about national affairs as a senior reporter for Politico. At the New York Times, Maggie rose to prominence for her coverage of the Trump administration and as author of Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. As a journalist seeking the truth, Maggie is able to see through the fog of political misinformation, social media manipulation, AI news generation, and attacks on the press in order to report the facts. For this, she has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Front Page Award for Journalist of the Year from the Newswomen's Club of New York, the Aldo Beckman Award for Journalistic Excellence from the White House Correspondents Association, and of course, the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting, shared with colleagues at the Times and Washington Post. But these awards are mere milestones on the road to Boise, where we are proud tonight to recognize her contributions to journalistic excellence and the defense of democracy with the Frank and Bethine Church Award for Public Service, which I'm sure will go high on her wall above all others. Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, this is a much bigger room than I had realized. Thank you for having me. I am a better question answerer actually than I am speaker, but so I hope you'll indulge me for a bit in my pageless remarks here that are on my phone. This is one of the few times that I've been asked to speak publicly in the last 6 years that wasn't exclusively about Donald Trump, and I said exclusively because I'm sure we'll talk about him, or current political events, but journalism itself, and namely the role of a free press in a democracy, why we do what we do, and why I hope people who are looking at a career path after college will continue to join our ranks. But to some extent, it is impossible to talk about those issues without talking about the person who held the highest elected office in the United States for 4 years. And so I'd like you to indulge me in a quick story about how we journalists see our roles versus how so many people in the political milieu have come to see our role in recent history. And so I think back a lot these days to my last presidential interview with Donald Trump, which was at the end of January 2019. And I had gone to the Oval Office with my colleague, Peter Baker, and our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, for an interview. Now, Trump had been trying to invite A.G. to a private dinner at the White House, which A.G. refused to do. But he did say he would come to the White House so long as his reporters could interview Trump, which Trump agreed to. So off we went. And after many minutes at this interview, spent discussing current events and policy, AG told the president that he needed to raise the fact that Trump's language calling the media the enemy of the people was being used by despots around the globe to justify their crackdowns on a free press. In response, Trump complained repeatedly about our coverage of him. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but the response was essentially, I think I'm entitled to a good story from my paper. The New York Times occupies a unique place in Trump's psyche. It represents the elite media enterprise whose validation he sought as he was beginning to form the foundation of his public persona in New York City in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as an outer borough real estate developer who was trying to make it in Manhattan. So his interest in, quote unquote, his paper was specific, but his belief that coverage simply should exist to chronicle what prominent figures do and nothing more was not. This is unfortunately how a number of elected officials, private business people, celebrities, and others now view the press. I asked Trump in that interview, sitting with Peter Baker and A.G. Sulzberger, as AG tried to impress upon him the weight of his words about the media and how they were being heard around the world, what Trump thinks the role of the press actually is. His response was to cover events fairly and accurately. Now, the reality is that our role is far more significant than that. These days, it is also far more challenging. It was unfortunate that at no point in our meeting did Trump comment on the role of a free press in a democracy. I'm not sure it's something that has ever crossed his mind. Nonetheless, it is what we do. And it was extremely important that our publisher across the Resolute desk from the most powerful man in the country took him to task for his language. We hold a unique role in a democracy. We are watchdogs against corruption. We are explainers of policy. We are there to hold the powerful accountable for what they say and what they do. We cover state houses, city halls, legislatures, school board meetings, White House press briefings, elections. We dig up information, we vet elected officials and candidates. At our riskiest, we cover wars and autocracies in foreign countries. One of our colleagues from the Wall Street Journal is currently in prison in Russia for doing his job. There are many jobs that are harder than ours, but few that come with as big a responsibility. And it is a responsibility that we need to bear in mind. We are also, at a basic level, humans, and we are susceptible to human error. A lot of what we do in our jobs comes down to judgment calls. We do not always get it right. But I believe the vast majority of us try to do the right thing. More often than not, we succeed, and when we err, we try to correct it. It is often said and has been said tonight, but it bears repeating, journalism right now is in fact more vital than at any time in recent memory. It became clear at some point in 2016 that in our highly polarized times, there were no longer simply disagreements of opinion, but a lack of a shared set of facts to agree upon. That was what stood out to me during that incredibly caustic campaign. And so that makes journalism harder in many ways, because our role is to find the best obtainable version of the truth for the first draft of history that we can. We need to be vigilant in an era in which people are trying, for a variety of reasons, to mislead journalists or to outright lie to us. We need to stress test the information we're getting as we are putting together our report, often under circumstances that are faster than ever before. We are facing an increasing number of people who reject speaking to us. We get a lot of doors closed in our faces. But we keep going. Sometimes people will decide they want to tell us their story or confide secret information that they're providing, sometimes at great risk to themselves. For those of you in the room who are considering a career in journalism, who are much younger than I am now, I will say forever that it is worth it. You are discovering new things every day, and in the best case scenario, you are impacting people's lives every day. Now, I want to talk a bit about how I arrived here, and just note that I did indeed get up at 2 a.m. Boise time this morning, so you have to forgive me. I have had the benefit of working for 4 major news outlets: the New York Post, the New York Daily News, Politico, and the New York Times. The way that I became a journalist was not intentional. I cut my teeth as a young reporter at the Post, more often than not covering crime, which is traditionally how reporters learn when they're at a big city newspaper. It taught me the impact we have on people's lives, how we document injuries done to people, how we describe what takes place in neighborhoods in the cities in which we live, how the services within those cities are carried out. And just a few more words about that. I started at the Post as a clerk, after studying fiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and struggling to find a job at a magazine after I graduated. And at the same time, I was bartending to pay my rent, experience that I found invaluable in learning how to talk to people, and that I cannot recommend highly enough for aspiring journalists. A clerk was not a glamorous job. It involved getting coffee for editors, collating faxes from the fax machines, rushing page proofs of the next day's paper from one desk or office to another as deadline approached. But one day a week, I was allowed to go on general assignment as a reporter for a day. And it was how I learned not just how to do the job, but about the parts of a city I had grown up in, that I was still just learning to understand. That path is harder now because of how many newspapers have closed, because of how attrited this industry is. But there are still a number of opportunities for young journalists, even in this grimmer landscape. Every television network has a news website that functions as a newspaper. Outlets like Axios have tried to establish local news outposts in various states. Politico, where I spent 5 years, is growing. There are places where young journalists can learn and thrive, either in major cities like New York and Washington, or elsewhere in the country. Working at 2 major newspapers in a metropolis, I had the benefit of learning from great teachers, people who shaped what is often called the daily miracle of a print edition. The profession has lost a number of them, as the industry has been reshaped by the digital era, by closures of local newsrooms, and by layoffs across the industry. And part of the mission of journalism and regaining trust has to be finding a way to put premium on experience. Even as I am encouraging people to get into this business, there is nothing that can supplant people who have had long careers. Long before Donald Trump came into office, the news media was struggling with a loss of reader trust. This did not develop overnight. For decades, trust has been eroding in the press, just as voters were becoming sour after a string of national traumas: the second impeachment in the nation's history in the late 1990s, an election settled at the US Supreme Court, a terrorist attack that killed thousands in 3 different locations, 2 overseas wars, and a fiscal crisis in which relatively few people in the financial industry saw legal consequences. This loss of faith in institutions extended to the news media. I think people in my profession have been working to restore it, but it takes time. And it is difficult not only when, as I said before, there is increasingly no agreed upon fact set, but a proliferation of news that makes it harder for people to know who to trust. And increasingly, that means people are just tuning it all out altogether. Now, one question that has been vexing for years is who is paying for news, both as consumers and as producers of journalism. The Times has talked publicly about success with a subscription model. The Washington Post has a very wealthy backer. A number of papers haven't been so lucky. Some have closed, others purchased by hedge funds. And a problem in the industry has been that people have been used to paying for a hard copy of a newspaper at a newsstand. But with so much free on the internet, they anticipate they should be able to get all of their news for free as well. News, and I mean quality journalism, is expensive. It is not unreasonable that newsrooms ask people to pay for content, as frustrating as that may be for readers. Now, this subscription model has taken on a number of forms, but as with everything else in news, it can ebb and flow. Figuring out the most sustainable model of high-quality journalism is a conundrum that is still being worked on. I don't have a great answer for it, beyond what outlets are already trying. If the solutions were clear, someone much smarter than I am would have come up with it a while ago. And then there is the question of how we conduct ourselves as we do our work in this toxic environment politically. Not every journalist behaves the same way. Not everyone approaches stories or targets the same way. For myself, and I talked about this with some of you earlier, I try to be as direct and upfront with people who I'm covering as possible, so they feel they've had a chance to respond to what we're publishing. If you've handled yourself in an integrous way, that is all you can do. We are a bit of a ways from where things were a few years ago, when a US president openly called reporters the enemy of the people, even as he yearned for mainstream media approval. And while I don't want to spend too much time right now on Donald Trump, I think he remains an illustrative example of the challenges for journalists in this day and age in several ways. Trump spent decades learning from his mentor, the disgraced lawyer and fixer from the McCarthy era, Roy Cohn, to yell and say things are fake, to instill just enough of a kernel of doubt in people's minds that they're not sure what to think. He has now created a whole ecosystem that echoes it, which was already coming into focus after the Tea Party wave of 2010. And yet so many people don't realize that he's essentially playing a game, and why would they? With one side of his mouth, the former president says reporters are fake news. With the other, he says, come aboard my private plane as I'm traveling to campaign stops. So many of his followers don't realize this is not always a sincere, heartfelt anger, but an effort to erode trust in what we write, and trust in what we write about him specifically. And there are now many people who emulate that style. The challenge and key, in my mind, for reporters is not to appear to be taking the bait, regardless of how angry any person you're covering gets at you. In my mind, you are not there to get into a shouting match. Marty Baron, the former top editor of the Washington Post, famously said, "We're not at war, we're at work." And I think that is important to remember. To the aspiring journalists in this room, I would say to you, when people become aggressive in interviews, continue to do your job. When people try to get a rise out of you, do your best not to let them. And to the extent you can, remember that social media is forever, and it isn't a Slack channel or a text thread that others can't see. It adds to people's perceptions of how you're doing your job. Stick to the facts because the truth will out. I want to talk for a few minutes about the proliferation of partisan media. It became clear at some point many years ago that with people mistrustful of legacy media, and with content suddenly everywhere, the ability to choose your own adventure in the news was clearly appealing. People were seeking out news and websites that affirmed their pre-existing beliefs, and they still are. If that kind of work appeals to you, you should do it. There are sites where you can produce good, solid work on policy and politics, and if you have a viewpoint, that will fit. In my opinion, it is vital to hear voices of people who don't agree with you, no matter how repellent you may find them or their views. There is so much anger infused in almost every discussion these days, and when it seeps into news coverage, I personally find it counterproductive. That isn't to say that news outlets shouldn't describe things as they are, or all things as what they are. One of the most visible changes since Trump left office has been the willingness of major media outlets, including my own, to call Trump's claims that he won the 2020 election lies. Those lies have had a trickle-down effect that has been durable and had a huge impact on the 2022 midterms. To that end, some of the most vital reporting of the last 6 years in this country took place in the wake of the January 6, 2021 attack by a pro-Trump mob at the Capitol building in DC. It was in the form of books by reporters at the Washington Post and the New York Times, in daily news stories from my colleagues. Information was revealed long before people leading official inquiries got to it. There was a comprehensive effort to inform the public. That body of work underscores for me how vital our role is. And my final thought is about news literacy and its importance. Now, we have seen in a couple of states efforts to have a uniform news literacy program in schools pop up. I think we're a long way from any kind of a national curriculum, but it's a start. And if people are going to start trusting news again, I cannot stress enough how much I believe news literacy is a big part of that. With that, I thank you for your time.